The classroom was still, the faint scratching of pens and the occasional cough breaking the silence. Richard sat at the desk, scanning the essays that lay before him. He wore his habitual expression of concentration, though deep down, he felt a creeping numbness. 10 years of teaching literature at the university had left him with a peculiar blend of fulfillment and fatigue. He had once believed in the transformative power of words, in their ability to shape minds and inspire change. But lately, even the greatest works of literature felt dulled by the routine of parsing them out to inattentive students. Each semester seemed to blend into the next, a carousel of familiar questions and half-hearted answers. Richard rubbed his temples and glanced at the clock. 15 minutes remained in class, enough time to review a few more points. He stood, clearing his throat, and began to speak, his voice steady but devoid of the passion that had once defined it. And then she raised her hand. Emily. He hadn't noticed her at first. She had a way of blending in, her quiet demeanor overshadowed by more boisterous classmates. But today, there was a confidence in the way she held herself, an eagerness that was hard to ignore. Her question was precise, insightful, cutting straight to the heart of the text in a way that took him by surprise. He paused, his response catching in his throat, and looked at her. She met his gaze without hesitation, her eyes bright and unwavering. It was rare for a student to challenge him, even rarer for them to do so with such clarity. "That's an excellent point," he said finally, his voice softening. "Would you care to elaborate?" Emily smiled, a faint curve of her lips, and began to speak. The room seemed to shift, the monotony broken by the rhythm of her words. She spoke with conviction, her thoughts leaping beyond the pages of the syllabus, weaving connections that felt fresh and unexpected. It was intoxicating, the way her mind worked, the way she seemed to breathe life into the text. For the first time in months, Richard felt the stirrings of something he couldn't quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or a longing to feel connected to the material again, to see it through new eyes. Whatever it was, it lingered, even as the class came to an end and the students began to file out. Emily lingered, gathering her things with deliberate slowness. As she passed his desk, she paused, her hand brushing against the edge of the table. "Thank you for today's lecture," she said, her voice low but sincere. "It was inspiring." Richard nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Thank you, Emily. That means a lot." And then she was gone, leaving behind a faint trace of her perfume and an impression that would not easily fade. He sat there for a long time after, staring at the empty classroom, the silence pressing in around him. Something had shifted, though he couldn't quite articulate what. All he knew was that the routine no longer felt so suffocating, and for the first time in a long while, he found himself looking forward to the next class. The next few weeks passed in a blur, a rush of papers to grade, meetings to attend, and lectures to deliver. But through it all, Emily's presence lingered in the back of his mind, like an echo of something long forgotten. Every time he entered the classroom, he found his gaze wandering toward her, searching for that spark of brilliance she had shown. Her answers grew sharper, more assured, each response carrying a weight that pulled his attention deeper into her world. And in the silence of his office after class, when he reviewed the essays and notes, he found himself replaying her words, lingering on the way she phrased her ideas, the way she made literature seem alive again. One evening, as he sat grading a particularly dismal batch of essays, his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number, but there was something about the message that made his pulse quicken. "Professor, I would love to discuss the recent readings with you. Would you be available for coffee sometime? I have some thoughts I'd like to share." It was Emily. He stared at the screen for a long moment, debating. There's no harm in it, right? It was just a coffee, a student wanting to expand on the material. But as he typed out a simple reply, "Sure, tomorrow afternoon," he couldn't shake the feeling that Something else was simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't just a discussion about literature. He could feel it, that unspoken undercurrent. The way their exchanges had grown more charged. When they met the next day, she arrived early as always, settling into the chair across from him with a quiet grace. The cafe buzzed with the low hum of conversations and clinking cups, but there was a peculiar stillness between them, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. "I've been thinking a lot about the themes of alienation in the Metamorphosis," she said, her fingers lightly tapping the surface of her cup. "How Gregor's transformation wasn't just physical, but psychological. It's as though his very existence became a burden to those around him. He was trapped in his own mind, unable to escape the isolation." Richard nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere, drifting between her words and the subtle curve of her lips as she spoke. Her voice, quiet yet confident, seemed to vibrate with a resonance he couldn't quite place. "I think," she continued, unaware of the shift in his attention, "that we all experience something like that at some point. A moment where we feel disconnected, not just from others, but from ourselves. It's like being trapped inside a body that no longer belongs to you." Richard's heart gave a slight, unexpected lurch. He didn't know why her words cut so deep, but they did. Maybe it was the way she seemed to see him, or how the dissonance between her youth and his own years of weariness felt like a chasm he couldn't cross. "You're very perceptive," he said, his voice catching slightly. "But I think we all try to find a way out eventually." She smiled, and there was something knowing in the way her eyes lingered on him, a subtle invitation that tugged at the edges of his resolve. They spoke for hours, discussing more than just literature, their conversation veering toward life and loneliness and the strange spaces in between. Each word felt like a thread weaving them closer, and Richard, though aware of the danger, allowed it to happen. As they parted, Emily's hand brushed his ever so slightly. A brief touch, but it lingered in his memory like the fading warmth of sunlight. "I'm glad we could talk," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I think you're the only one who really understands what I mean." Richard smiled, though his thoughts were clouded. He should have left it there. He should have stepped back, recognized the boundaries that were blurring before his very eyes, but he didn't. He told himself it was just a conversation, that it meant nothing. But as she walked away, he couldn't deny the spark of something else, something dangerous, flickering in his chest. The lines between student and professor, between admiration and desire, began to blur. And with that, a decision was made, though he had no idea just how irreversible it would turn out to be. The days that followed carried a weight Richard hadn't anticipated. The quietude of his office, the hum of lectures, the grading, everything seemed to fall away in the wake of that coffee. Emily's presence lingered in the empty spaces, in the silent moments when his mind wandered, and he found himself replaying their conversation, word for word, like a book he couldn't put down. Her thoughts, her gaze, the way she seemed to understand the world in a way that felt so different from the people around him. He couldn't shake the feeling that she had glimpsed something in him that no one else had. He found excuses to look for her in the classroom, to see if that same fire still burned in her eyes. She had become a puzzle, a mystery he couldn't quite solve. She had a way of making him feel seen, in a way that his wife, Claire, hadn't in years. It wasn't that Claire didn't care. She did deeply. But there was something so familiar about their love, so safe in its routines, that it had become almost invisible. The small gestures, the quiet nods, the shared glances across the dinner table. It had all become too predictable. It was the kind of comfort that could easily slip into complacency. But with Emily, every interaction felt fresh, charged with an energy that he hadn't realized he was missing. It was only a matter of time before their paths crossed again, though Richard told himself each time that he could handle it. He had always prided himself on his self-control. He had a family, a life built on years of mutual love and trust. Claire deserved more than this distraction. Yet there was a pull he couldn't ignore. One afternoon after class, he found an envelope waiting for him on his desk. It was simple, unmarked, the handwriting on the front unmistakable. Emily's. His heart quickened as he opened it, half expecting some sort of essay or further intellectual exploration. But instead, there was a single note, written in delicate script. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation. I'd love to continue it if you're willing. I think you know what I mean." His fingers trembled as he folded the paper back into place. He couldn't help it. The feeling inside him, that undeniable stirring, had deepened, had solidified into something more. He could no longer pretend that this was just about literature or intellectual connection. There was something else, a longing, an undeniable attraction that hummed beneath the surface of every encounter. He felt as though something within him had been ignited, and it was impossible to put out. The next day, when he saw Emily sitting at the back of the classroom, her eyes locked onto him in a way that felt almost too intense, he knew he couldn't resist much longer. She had a way of drawing him in, without even trying, as if the magnetic force between them was just a natural force of nature, beyond their control. After class, as the students filtered out, he found himself standing there, frozen for a moment, caught between the past and the present. His heart raced in a way that had nothing to do with the academic discourse. He cleared his throat, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Emily," he said, his voice low, "I think we should talk." She didn't answer immediately, but there was a flicker in her eyes that made his pulse quicken. Then she stood, gathering her things with an effortless grace before walking toward him. Her presence was overwhelming. She stood close, too close, and yet it felt like the most natural thing in the world. There was no need for words, just a shared understanding, a tacit agreement that whatever was happening between them was bigger than either of them could handle alone. "I wasn't sure you'd respond," she murmured, her voice a soft murmur, a secret shared between them. "But I'm glad you did." Her eyes searched his, the vulnerability in them, both intoxicating and terrifying. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight, with a mixture of guilt and desire. "This isn't right," he told himself. "You're a professor. She's a student. You have a family. Claire needs you." But those voices, once so clear, now seemed distant, muffled by the intensity of the moment. His mind scrambled for an excuse, for a way to make sense of it all. But there was none. Not anymore. "Maybe we should take a walk," he suggested, his voice barely a whisper. Without hesitation, Emily nodded, and together, they stepped into the cool evening air. The world around them was alive with the colors of dusk, but Richard felt as though he were moving through a fog, each step pulling him further into a reality he wasn't sure he wanted, but couldn't resist. As they walked, their conversation drifted from literature to the weightier topics of life. The quiet disappointments, the lost opportunities, the things left unsaid between people who had been together too long or too little. It was so easy to talk to her, so easy to feel understood, in a way that he hadn't felt in years. His marriage, once so solid, now seemed distant, a distant echo in the recesses of his mind. They reached the park, and the air between them thickened. Richard could feel the pull of something unspoken, something heavier than the cool evening air. Emily stopped walking, turning to face him, her gaze unwavering. And then, without a word, she stepped closer. The space between them disappeared, and Richard found himself frozen in place, his heart hammering in his chest. The world seemed to slow as she looked at him, a challenge, an invitation, all in that one gaze. He could feel the warmth of her breath against his skin, and suddenly, all the reasons he should pull away seemed impossibly far away. The moment stretched into eternity, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He could taste the decision in the air, feel it inching toward him like the turning of a page in a book he couldn't put down. "I've been waiting for you to realize," Emily said softly, her voice barely audible over the beating of his heart. And in that moment, Richard knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't be able to stop it. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. Richard couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't remember a time when everything had been so clear, so safe. The moments with Emily were like shards of glass, beautiful and dangerous, each one cutting into the fabric of his life. But every time he tried to pull away, every time he tried to remind himself of his responsibilities, of Claire, he found himself being pulled back, deeper into the gravity of something he couldn't explain, couldn't contain. The next time he saw Emily, it wasn't in the classroom. It was on campus, where the air was crisp and the late afternoon light bled through the branches of trees, casting long shadows on the pavement. He had told himself for the past few days that he would be strong, that he would resist. But when he saw her standing there, waiting near the fountain, all his resolve crumbled. Her gaze met his from across the courtyard, and something in her eyes, something quiet, knowing, told him she had been waiting, just as he had been. She didn't say a word when he approached, just smiled, that same enigmatic smile that left his chest aching with something he couldn't name. It wasn't happiness, not exactly. It was something darker, something more urgent. They walked together, side by side, the silence between them comfortable in a way that both unnerved and drew him in. He felt like he was stepping onto a path with no clear destination, a path that could end in ways he couldn't predict. But the strangest thing was he didn't want to predict it. He didn't want to resist anymore. "I've been thinking," Emily said, her voice light, but with an edge he couldn't ignore, "about us, about everything." Richard felt his stomach tighten. Everything. The word hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all the things they hadn't said yet. All the things he wasn't sure he wanted to acknowledge. "You don't have to think about it too hard," he replied, his voice strained, though he hadn't meant it to be. "We're just talking." But Emily stopped walking, turning to face him. Her gaze locked onto his, and for a moment, the rest of the world fell away. "We both know it's not just talking," she said softly. "We both know there's more. I can see it in your eyes." Richard swallowed. The words he wanted to say caught in his throat. "I'm not like this," he wanted to say. "I never meant for any of this to happen." But there was something in the way she looked at him, something that made him feel as though his denial only made him more complicit. "I can't," he started, but the words faltered. "You're a student," he thought. "This is wrong." But as he spoke, he realized there was no part of him that could walk away, no part that could deny the pull between them. The connection had already been made, and there was no unmaking it. Emily's voice was a whisper, just loud enough for him to hear, her breath warm against his skin as she stepped closer. "You don't have to fight it," she said, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. The contact was light, but it sent a jolt through him, and suddenly, the space between them felt impossibly small. "We're not the first, and we won't be the last. It's just a moment in time, a chance to feel something real." Richard's mind screamed at him to pull away, to stop this before it spiraled any further. But his body, his heart, they betrayed him. In the back of his mind, Claire's face flickered, but it was distant, fading in the shadows as the warmth of Emily's touch ignited something inside him that he couldn't silence. "I don't know what to do anymore," he confessed, his voice breaking. The words were a surrender, a breaking of something deep inside. It wasn't just about Emily. It was about everything: his marriage, the monotony of his life, the part of himself he had left behind. "I don't know how to make it stop." Emily stepped even closer, her breath against his ear. He could feel the heat radiating off her, and the world seemed to shrink, narrowing down to just the two of them. "You don't have to make it stop," she whispered. "Not yet." And just like that, the decision was made. The next few hours were a blur, a haze of conflicting emotions and undeniable pulls. They spent time together, talking and walking, though the words became less significant as they neared the edge of something much more dangerous. Richard tried to fight it, tried to keep his distance, but the closer they came to the edge, the more the safety net of his life felt like a distant memory. By the time they were standing in front of her dorm, the tension between them had reached a breaking point. Emily paused before the door, turning to face him one last time. "Don't worry," she said, her voice soft and teasing, but there was an undeniable weight to it. "I won't tell anyone, but I think you're starting to see what I mean. We all want something more. We all want to feel alive again." Richard looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. Was he the man who once promised to protect and cherish his wife? Or was he the man standing here, at the edge of a precipice, about to jump? Before he could speak, she leaned in, her lips brushing his cheek in a gesture that was light, but loaded with meaning. "See you soon, Professor," she said, and the door closed behind her with a soft click. Richard stood there, rooted to the spot, his heart pounding, his mind a whirlwind of regret and longing. He knew the path he was on was one that could not be undone. There was no going back. It had been a week, but it felt like a lifetime. The routine of his days had turned hollow. He moved through the motions, lectures, papers, emails, everything a blur as his mind was consumed with the choice he had made. Emily's presence loomed over him like a shadow, always there, in every quiet moment. He could still feel the warmth of her lips on his cheek, the weight of her gaze, the electricity of that touch that had started it all. It wasn't just the physical pull, though. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. She had tapped into a part of him that he hadn't realized existed, a part of him that had been buried under years of complacency, of routine. The part of him that still wanted to feel alive, wanted to remember what it was like to be desired, to be seen. But there was also guilt, a gnawing, relentless guilt. It sat in his stomach like a stone, heavy and suffocating. He saw Claire, her quiet smile, her warm touch at night, the familiarity of their shared life, and yet it felt like a life he had somehow outgrown. Claire didn't know. How could she? He had convinced himself that the distance between them was just part of the ebb and flow of a long marriage. But now, it felt like a chasm he couldn't cross. One evening, after another long day of grading papers, Richard found himself sitting alone in his office, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound in the room. He had received an email from Emily earlier in the day, a brief note saying she was in the library if he wanted to talk. The invitation was there, clear and simple, but it felt like a trap. And yet, despite the chaos in his mind, his legs had moved before his brain could catch up. He stood up, leaving the clutter of his desk behind, walking toward the door. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit his face, a stark contrast to the heat simmering inside him. His heart was racing now, the familiar tug of something forbidden pulling him toward the campus. The library was quiet when he arrived. A few students were scattered around the tables, but it was nearly empty, save for one figure sitting by the large windows at the far end of the room. Emily. Her head was down, her hair cascading over her shoulders in a cascade of dark waves, but she knew he was there before he even spoke. "Professor," she said, her voice soft and almost playful. "I was starting to think you'd never come." Richard hesitated, but then his feet were moving toward her, as though drawn by some invisible force. He sat down across from her, and for a moment they were silent, both of them acutely aware of the weight of what was happening, of what had already happened. "You wanted to talk," he said finally, his voice low, trying to keep it steady. She looked at him then, her eyes dark, with something unreadable. There was a certain calm in her gaze, a certainty that he couldn't ignore. "I did," she said simply, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "But I think you already know what this is about, don't you?" Richard swallowed hard, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He couldn't deny it, anymore. The guilt, the longing, the desire. It was all tangled together in ways he couldn't explain, but it had a grip on him now. The only thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't run from it any longer. I can't keep doing this, he admitted, his voice breaking as the words left his mouth. I don't want to hurt Claire. I don't want to hurt you either, but I can't keep lying to myself. I've never been more confused in my life. Emily's expression softened, her gaze steady. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his hand, a gesture so small, but so intimate that it made his chest tighten. I don't want to hurt anyone either, she said quietly. But I think we both know that what's happening here isn't something either of us can ignore anymore. It's real, Richard. What we have, it's real. He closed his eyes, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. He could feel the weight of his life pressing in on him, suffocating him, and in that moment he realized something. The connection he had with Emily, as dangerous as it was, had awakened something in him, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. But that didn't mean it was right. It didn't mean it was sustainable. I need to fix this, he whispered, more to himself than to her. I need to fix everything. Emily's eyes were full of understanding. She didn't speak right away, but when she did, her voice was steady, even gentle. You can't fix everything, Richard, she said softly. Some things are just meant to be broken. Some things, they just have to end. The silence stretched between them, a gap that neither of them could bridge. Richard felt it then, the finality of it all. His mind screamed at him to reach out, to pull her back, to make the choice that would preserve his marriage, his family. But it was too late. The path had already been laid out, and there was no turning back. Emily stood, her chair scraping softly against the floor. She looked down at him, her eyes soft with something he couldn't name, regret maybe, or something more fragile. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I think we've reached the end of this chapter. You have to make your choice now. Richard watched as she walked away, her figure disappearing into the dimly lit hall of the library. He stayed there for a long time, the silence wrapping around him, suffocating him. He knew what he had to do. He knew that he had to go home, to face Claire, to confront the life he had built, and the life he had almost thrown away. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't know if he could. When he finally returned to his apartment that night, the weight of the choice felt like a physical thing pressing down on his chest. Claire was sitting on the couch, her eyes flickering to him as he entered. She had no idea what he had been through, what he had done, or what he had almost lost. He stood there for a moment, looking at her, the woman who had given him everything, and yet in that moment, he felt like a stranger to her, a stranger to himself. Richard? Claire's voice was soft, filled with concern. Are you okay? And Richard knew, with a crushing certainty, that the decision was his. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could still choose what would come next. The path wasn't clear, and the future was full of uncertainty. But for the first time in a long while, he understood what it meant to feel truly alive, and maybe that was the hardest part of all. Richard stood in the hallway, the silence heavy as he faced Claire. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, but there was no turning back now. He walked toward her, his voice shaky as he spoke. I've been lost, he admitted, in what's safe, what's familiar, but I see now that I've taken it all for granted. Claire's eyes softened, but there was sadness in them. She nodded slowly, as if understanding something he couldn't yet articulate. I've been lost too, she said quietly. We can't keep going like this. Richard's heart ached, the depth of his mistake crashing over him. I want to fix this, if you'll let me. Claire took a deep breath. I don't know if I can trust you again, Richard, but I don't want to let go of what we had. Not without a fight. Richard nodded, a quiet promise in his heart. I'll wait. She met his gaze, the uncertainty still there. but something fragile and hopeful flickered between them. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he wasn't alone on the journey. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would walk it together.